Picture this. You are Margot, a young bride of only 15 winters, standing in the dim doorway of a stone cottage in the year 1347. The walls close in with the scent of damp straw and smoke. Every breath you take feels too shallow, too quick. The rushes beneath your feet crackle like dry bones, each step echoing the fear that coils in your chest. Tonight is the night you leave behind girlhood, not because you chose it, but because a bargain has already been struck on your behalf. Henrik approaches. He is nearly twice your age, his broad frame bent slightly by years of toil. His hands are rough, the skin thickened with calluses, and his face is a map of weather and hardship. To your father he was not a stranger, he was a deal. 3 pigs and half an acre of barley were worth more than your innocence. And so here you are, trembling in the flickering light, clutching the coarse woolen shift your mother stitched for you. The very same she once wore on her own wedding night, as did her mother before her. A garment handed down not as a keepsake of love, but as a uniform for duty. Beyond the thin wooden walls, the voices of men thunder with drink and cruel anticipation. They are gathered outside, singing bawdy songs, clanging pots with wooden spoons, refusing to disperse until they hear proof. Your cries, your body, will serve as evidence of this union's legitimacy. You know they will not be satisfied with silence. In this moment, your terror is not just of Henrik. It is of the jeering crowd, of the world that demands your body perform its role in public ritual. Henrik's shadow stretches across the bed, his fingers reaching for the leather cord at your throat. Your mother's whispered lessons about wifely duty flash through your mind, words that once seemed distant, even abstract. But nothing could prepare you for this night, for the press of his presence, for the truth that marriage is not a choice but an inheritance of submission. This is not a love story. It is the truth of medieval intimacy, an intimacy twisted by superstition, crushed beneath the weight of religion, and bound by survival. The bed is not a sanctuary. It is a battlefield, a stage where church doctrine, family honor, and ancient fears all demand their due. Before diving into these forgotten stories of survival and suffering, if you enjoy learning about the hidden truths of history, consider hitting that like button and subscribing for more content like this. And please comment below to let me know where you're listening from. In the medieval world, no bed was ever truly private. Every act between husband and wife was shadowed by the church, judged by neighbors, haunted by pagan whispers that lingered through the centuries. And so, as Margot steps into her wedding night, she carries not only her own dread, but the weight of an entire civilization's fears, desire twisted into sin, intimacy bound in shame, and survival resting on submission. The marriage bed in Margot's world was never hers alone. In medieval Europe, consummation was not a private vow but a public matter, a ritual that belonged as much to the community as to the couple themselves. To marry was to submit not only to a husband but to the eyes, ears, and judgment of neighbors, priests, and family. The ceremony began long before Margot and Henrik were left in the cottage together. After the feast and drunken revelry, guests would perform what was known as the bedding ritual. With bawdy songs on their lips, they dragged bride and groom to their chamber, stripping away clothes as if peeling away modesty itself. Laughter rang out as friends and kin made jokes too crude for prayer yet spoken in the same breath as blessings. For a young girl like Margot, it was not a celebration but a parade of humiliation, each gesture a reminder that her body was no longer her own. Once thrust into the bed, the couple was expected to fulfill the final act. But outside the door, the village lingered, listening. Proof was required, not of affection, not of tenderness, but of blood. A bride's virginity was her family's currency, and like any coin, it had to be tested. The cries of pain, the stain of blood on linen, these were considered legal evidence, the seal of a contract between families. Without them, a marriage could be annulled, a bride dishonored, a father shamed. The pressure was immense. Young brides sometimes resorted to trickery. A hidden pin to prick the finger, a vial of animal blood slipped onto the sheets, desperate measures to protect both themselves and the fragile reputation of their kin. For in a world where family honor outweighed truth, the absence of blood was not explained by anatomy but branded as fraud. This cruel obsession was born of misunderstanding. Medieval medicine imagined the hymen not as delicate tissue but as a solid barrier, a gate sealing the body until it was forcefully broken. They believed it an infallible proof of chastity, blind to the truth, that it could vanish through a fall, a ride on horseback, or sometimes not exist at all. To them, biology was not science but morality, and women bore its burden. For Margot, the ritual was suffocating. Outside her chamber, the men's songs turned into silence, their ears pressed against the wood, waiting. Her cries would be their entertainment, her pain their confirmation, her blood their triumph. The wedding bed was not a sanctuary. It was a courtroom where innocence was proved or denied before an invisible jury. This was the reality for countless women of her time. To marry was to surrender to public scrutiny, to have one's most private moments displayed as evidence for all. Even in the smallest stone cottage, the weight of the community pressed in, making intimacy a spectacle and turning love, or the lack of it, into law. If the villagers outside Margot's cottage claimed her body as proof of honor, the church claimed it as a vessel of sin. To the medieval mind, intimacy was never just physical, it was spiritual warfare. Every touch, every gasp, every movement in the dark could tilt the scales of salvation or damnation. The voices that thundered loudest were those of the church fathers. Saint Jerome, writing in the 4th century, had warned that a husband who loved his wife too ardently was an adulterer in spirit. Pleasure, even inside marriage, was viewed with suspicion, a corruption of the soul. Saint Augustine carried that fear forward, teaching that desire itself was a scar left by original sin. What hope did Margot have, if love itself was poisoned by doctrine? By the 13th century, Thomas Aquinas had transformed these whispers into law. In his Summa Theologica, he catalogued the rules of the marriage bed with the precision of a tax ledger. Sex was allowed only on certain days, forbidden during Lent, Advent, holy feasts, or even Wednesdays and Fridays. Entire seasons of the year were declared barren of intimacy. The body was expected to bend to the calendar of heaven. And then there was position. Only one was permitted, man above, woman below, face to face. It mirrored the hierarchy God had written into creation, male dominance, female submission. To invert that order, to let a woman rise above, was not merely scandalous. It was sinful. To stray into the practices of animals was to risk one's soul itself. The church called such acts against nature, words that still echo centuries later. When these laws were applied, the result was chilling. Couples who followed every commandment, every fast day and holy season, might find themselves permitted to join only 50 times in a year. 50 moments allowed for passion, and each moment shadowed by fear. For Margot, even the marriage bed offered no refuge. To submit to Henrik when he reached for her on a forbidden Wednesday in Lent was to imperil her soul. Yet to deny him was to invite his rage, for a husband's rights stood above a wife's conscience. Here, obedience was a double cage, to God and to man. Margot's body was caught between them, squeezed by rules so strict they drained tenderness from desire and left only duty. Every embrace became a calculation, every kiss a risk, every child conceived not in joy but in a climate of dread. The bedroom was no sanctuary. It was a parish, a courtroom, and sometimes a prison. The whisper of theology intruded between the sheets, and the fear of eternal fire lay as heavily on the bed as any husband. For Margot, the weight of obedience pressed from every side. In her world, marriage was not a bond of affection but a contract of subordination. A wife's duty was to yield, to bend, to endure. If she refused her husband, she risked more than his anger, she risked the scorn of her neighbors, the judgment of her priest, even the wrath of God. In medieval thought, a wife was her husband's property, her consent dissolved the moment vows were spoken. The concept of marital rape did not exist because, by law and faith, a wife had no body left to claim as her own. When Henrik reached for Margot on a night forbidden by the church calendar, she faced a cruel choice. To submit meant risking her soul, branded a sinner for indulging in pleasure on sacred days. To resist meant defiance, and defiance was dangerous. In a world where domestic violence was legal, expected even, a husband's fist was considered an instrument of correction. A woman's bruises were not evidence of crime but of her failure to obey. The blows were justified as discipline, her silence demanded as proof of virtue. And this silence was fortified by science, or what passed for it. Medieval medicine, inherited from Greek and Roman sources, taught that women were little more than defective men. Their bodies were incomplete versions of the male form. The vagina, physicians insisted, was an inverted penis. The ovaries were merely internal testicles, their value only in their capacity to carry a man's seed. To exist as a woman was to exist as an error of nature, a flaw corrected only through subjugation. These beliefs were not confined to dusty manuscripts. They seeped into confessionals, courts, and homes. Priests instructed husbands to govern their wives with firmness, while wives were told to endure as an act of holiness. Even physicians, the men who claimed to heal, reinforced the idea that women's bodies were unstable, prone to wandering wombs and fits of hysteria unless anchored by a man's authority. For Margot, these truths were lived realities. Each time she lowered her eyes before Henrik, Each time she pressed her lips together to silence a protest, she was not simply obeying him. She was obeying centuries of doctrine and superstition that told her she was lesser, weaker, more dangerous to herself and others if she resisted. Her submission was not just a household expectation, it was the law of heaven and earth alike. The burden was heavy, but what made it cruelest was its invisibility. To Margot's community, her obedience was natural. To the church it was sacred. To physicians it was necessary. Only to Margot did it feel like chains woven from scripture, custom, and fear, pressing down on her until even her most private moments were no longer her own. If obedience defined Margot's daily life, distorted science defined her body. Medieval medicine did not simply misunderstand women, it actively reshaped how society treated them. What physicians wrote in Latin echoed in the decisions of courts, the sermons of priests, and the whispered warnings of mothers to daughters. One of the most influential voices was Constantine the African, an 11th century physician whose translations of Arabic and Greek medical texts flooded European universities. His writings claimed that women experience pleasure differently than men, that their bodies required extended stimulation and even multiple climaxes in order to conceive. At first glance, it might seem progressive, a recognition that female desire mattered. But in practice it was twisted into cruelty. From this belief arose a nightmare, the claim that rape could not cause pregnancy. If a woman conceived, medieval courts often declared it proof that she must have secretly enjoyed the assault. Her very body betrayed her, transforming her from victim to accomplice. Justice was denied not because evidence was lacking, but because science said so. For Margot and countless others, this was the cruelest betrayal, when the law of men was reinforced by the supposed law of nature. And then there was the theory of the wandering womb. Physicians believed the uterus was not fixed but roamed freely within the female body, drifting upward to strangle the lungs or downward to suffocate the organs. Madness, fainting, even sudden death were blamed on this restless organ. Treatments were both absurd and terrifying. Sweet-smelling herbs burned beneath the body to lure the womb back into place, foul odors pressed to the nose to drive it downward, or binding cloths tied tight around the waist to cage it. For women, even their own anatomy was depicted as a dangerous beast that needed taming. These ideas were not fringe, they were the accepted medical truths of the age, copied in manuscripts, taught to students, repeated in courts. They reinforced the notion that women were unstable, irrational, in need of constant control. If a wife resisted her husband, it was not because of fear or pain but because her body was defective, her womb wandering, her nature flawed. The shadow of these beliefs reached far beyond Margot's bed. They crept into every corner of medieval society. Priests cautioning men about their wives' inconstant humors, midwives invoking charms against wombs gone astray, neighbors whispering that a woman's madness was punishment for failing to submit. For Margot, knowledge was a curse. She knew her body would always be interpreted through the lens of men's theories, her pain dismissed, her desire mistrusted, her very existence marked as incomplete. In such a world, even the act of being female was treated as a sickness to be managed, rather than a life to be lived. Beyond the walls of the church and the pages of Latin medicine, another tradition endured, older, quieter, passed from hand to hand in whispers and rituals. In Margot's world, women still turned to the forests and fields for remedies that the priests condemned as superstition. They called it witchcraft, but for many it was survival. In the pale light of the moon, women gathered herbs that carried both power and danger. Pennyroyal and tansy, small and unassuming plants, were brewed into teas that could prevent a pregnancy. Yet the line between medicine and poison was perilously thin. A cup too strong could stop not only conception but a heartbeat. Mandrake root, shaped like a tiny human body, was treasured as a charm of fertility. Worn against the skin, it was said to draw life into the womb. It was so sought after that impostors carved from bryony root were sold in markets, talismans of hope disguised as counterfeit miracles. The church thundered against such practices, condemning them from the pulpit as heresy. To drink a potion was to risk your soul, to wear an amulet was to flirt with the devil. But even the most devout could not wholly abandon these remedies. For when prayers to saints went unanswered, when childbirth claimed sisters and daughters, when hunger made another mouth unbearable, the knowledge of herbs was sometimes the only shield against despair. This secret knowledge was often guarded by village wise women, figures caught between reverence and fear. To some they were healers, to others witches. A woman might bless her labor by praying to Saint Margaret, patron of childbirth, and in the same breath bury a scrap of afterbirth beneath her threshold to ensure future fertility. She might carry a crucifix in public but keep a piece of amber tucked in her bodice to ward off miscarriage. In the medieval world, faith and magic were never entirely separate. They wove together in the shadows, threads of desperation binding both. But the danger was constant. The same woman who offered herbs to ease a cramp might be branded a sorceress if a cow died or a crop failed. Margot would have known this risk, even as she watched neighbors slip into the forest on moonlit nights to gather what the earth provided. It was not rebellion against the church so much as a refusal to abandon the fragile tools of survival. For medieval women, contraception was not a matter of choice but of sheer necessity. Each pregnancy carried the specter of death. Each birth was a gamble, and each child another mouth in a household already pressed by hunger. In such a world, to drink a bitter tea or whisper a charm over the body was not merely superstition. It was an act of desperate hope, of quiet defiance, and of love for life itself. For Margot, and for every woman of her time, the greatest shadow looming over marriage was not simply the burden of obedience or the sting of duty. It was childbirth. To carry life was to walk hand in hand with death, for the medieval womb was as much a tomb as a cradle. The numbers alone tell the story. 1 in 3 women would die during childbirth or in the days that followed. And those who survived often bore scars of torn flesh, infections, or broken bodies that left them barren or crippled for life. No herbal charm, no saint's prayer, no midwife's careful hands could entirely shield them from fate. To be a woman was to live with the knowledge that every birth could be the last. For married women this was a constant terror. For the unmarried, pregnancy was social death. A swollen belly without a husband's name brought disgrace, exile, or worse. A girl could be cast out of her home, branded a whore, or even killed to preserve her family's honor. The law was not written to protect her, it was written to protect the property rights of men. In such a cruel world, some women chose the darkest path. Infanticide, though officially condemned, was the unspoken secret. A mother, desperate and alone, might smother her newborn or leave it at the edge of the woods. These acts were born not of malice but of hopelessness, an attempt to survive in a society that offered no mercy. The church thundered against such sins, but the reality persisted, whispered about but rarely spoken aloud. For fathers, daughters were assets to be exchanged. Margot's virginity was her dowry, her blood more valuable than gold. A father might trade her for land, livestock, or favor, and the measure of her worth was her purity. In that exchange, her body became a contract signed in flesh, her future determined by the ink of lineage. Yet even after the marriage, a woman's survival depended on her womb. Children were necessary, for labor, for lineage, for survival of the family name. But with every pregnancy came the very real possibility of death. Women leaned on each other in these times. Midwives, mothers, sisters. They gathered around the birthing bed, praying, chanting, holding the body that trembled between two worlds. They cut herbs, whispered charms, pressed cool cloths to fevered brows. And when the child was finally born, they wrapped it in swaddling and hoped the mother's breath would still be steady by dawn. For Margot this knowledge was not distant. Even before her first birth, she would have seen it play out around her. Funerals for young brides, widowers left with infants clinging to their hands, families mourning daughters lost to labor. It was a cycle as relentless as the seasons. In her world, joy and terror shared the same bed, and the cries of a newborn were often followed by the silence of a mother who would never cry again. If childbirth was the greatest danger in a woman's life, then virginity was her greatest bargaining chip, though never her own to bargain with. In Margot's world, purity was wealth, and the proof of it was the most valuable dowry a father could offer. Her hymen was treated not as fragile flesh but as coin, traded between families to secure alliances, land, or livestock. The obsession was ritualized on the wedding night. Once consummation had taken place, the bloodied sheets were not quietly folded away, they were displayed. Guests who had dragged the bride and groom to their chamber now demanded evidence, proof that honor had been preserved and the contract fulfilled. Families gathered around the stained cloth as though it were a legal seal, a certificate of purity. If no blood appeared, the consequences could be brutal. A bride could be sent back to her family in disgrace, her marriage annulled, her name blackened forever. Worse still, she might be accused of deceit, branded a whore, or even executed for fraud. Entire households' reputations rested on this single moment of anatomy, as fragile and unpredictable as the flame of a candle. Young brides, terrified of failing this cruel test, often turned to desperate measures. Some pricked their fingers and smeared blood on the sheets. Others hid small bladders of animal blood beneath their clothes, ready to spill at the right moment. Tricks of survival, fragile masks meant to protect their bodies from shame or death. For Margot, the stakes of her wedding night were not only fear of Henrik's touch, but fear of failing the proof that the world demanded. All of this was built on a falsehood. Medieval medicine believed the hymen to be a solid barrier, an intact wall that could only be broken through penetration. In truth, the hymen varies and many girls are born without one at all. It can tear from horseback riding, from climbing, even from the simple play of childhood. But to Margot's society, these facts did not exist. They clung instead to superstition, condemning women for anatomy they could not control. Virginity was not merely a personal state, it was public property, woven into the honor of fathers, the pride of brothers, the worth of entire families. A girl's body became a ledger on which wealth and reputation were written, and the proof of blood was the ink that confirmed it. For Margot and for countless girls like her, this meant her most private self was never truly hers. Even the breaking of her body on her wedding night was less about her future as a wife than about her father's standing in the village. Virginity was currency and she was the coin. Virginity might have been the coin that sealed a marriage, but consummation was the stamp of its legitimacy. Without it, a union was not considered valid. This meant that the most intimate act between husband and wife could become a matter for priests, judges, and neighbors, a spectacle not just of the body but of the law. Church courts, tasked with ensuring the sanctity of marriage, frequently found themselves prying into the bedrooms of the faithful. When disputes arose, when a husband claimed his wife was barren, when a bride's family insisted consummation had not occurred, or when an annulment was sought, the courts became investigators of sex. Couples were dragged before bishops and clerics, questioned separately about the most private details of their wedding night. A husband might be asked, "Did you enter her? Was she open to you? Did she resist?" The wife would be interrogated, "Did you feel pain? Did you bleed? Did you take him fully?" Their answers were weighed against one another like testimonies in a criminal trial. If words were not enough, the church was not above demanding evidence. Women were examined for signs of penetration, a procedure humiliating and invasive. Neighbors, too, could be called as witnesses. They were asked what they heard through the walls, the muffled cries, the bed creaking, the laughter of the men waiting outside. In such cases, gossip became testimony, and whispers could decide the fate of marriages. For Margot, this meant her body was never truly hers. It could be summoned as evidence, its wounds and fluids discussed before men who claimed to guard souls. If Henrik declared dissatisfaction, or if his family sought an advantage, she could find herself judged not for virtue or faith but for how convincingly she had bled. These investigations reveal a chilling truth. Intimacy in medieval Europe was never beyond the reach of authority. The church claimed the right to peer through the keyhole of every marriage bed, transforming private moments into public trials. For women like Margot, the bedroom was a place of constant risk. To falter in her duty meant not only the wrath of her husband but the possibility of standing in a court, stripped not of clothes but of dignity, as strangers debated whether her marriage was real, whether her body had obeyed. As if the weight of law, custom, and community were not enough, Margot's nights carried another terror, one that could not be seen but was whispered of in every parish. The medieval bed was haunted not only by husbands and priests, but by demons. The church taught that the devil's agents prowled most eagerly in the hours of sleep, when the body was weakest and the soul unguarded. To men, the danger was the succubus, a female spirit who slid into dreams, seducing with soft touches and stolen kisses, feeding on lust until the victim awoke drained and shamed. To women, it was the incubus, a male demon of terrible strength who pinned them down in the dark, leaving them terrified, trembling, and, so it was believed, sometimes pregnant. These were not treated as mere legends. Theologians wrote of them as fact, physicians included them in medical texts, and priests thundered warnings about them from the pulpit. It was said that a demon could steal a man's seed in the guise of a succubus, then transform into an incubus and force that seed into a woman's womb. Children born of such unions were thought to be cursed, marked by darkness, sometimes even considered the offspring of witches. The symptoms described, pressure on the chest, the inability to move, the sense of being watched in the night, are what we now recognize as sleep paralysis. But in Margot's world, there was no medical explanation, only the terror of demonic assault. Women who spoke of such encounters risked being branded not victims but accomplices, accused of consorting with spirits or inviting the devil into their beds. Exorcisms were prescribed as remedies. Holy water sprinkled over the marriage bed, charms nailed into door frames, prayers whispered into the night. but suspicion always lingered. If a woman claimed too often to be visited by demons, the line between victim and witch grew dangerously thin. Many who suffered these nighttime terrors found themselves dragged before inquisitors, forced to confess under torture to unions they never sought, their cries of innocence drowned in the flames. For Margot the fear was twofold. Her body was already scrutinized by her husband, her family, her church. Now even her dreams were not safe. To wake in the night with a heavy weight on her chest was not simply a nightmare, it could be a death sentence if she dared to speak of it. In the medieval imagination, the bed was never empty. It was crowded with saints and demons, angels and devils, the living and the unseen. Desire itself was considered dangerous enough, but in the dark hours before dawn, even the silence of sleep could become a battlefield for the soul. If Margot's body was judged in her wedding bed, it was judged again each month by the blood that marked her cycle. In the medieval imagination, menstruation was not a natural rhythm but a curse, a wound inherited from Eve's sin. Each drop was viewed with suspicion, each flow a reminder of female frailty and divine punishment. Writers of the age insisted that menstrual blood was poison. It was said to wither crops, sour wine, and dull iron blades. Pliny the Elder, whose ancient words still echoed through medieval manuscripts, claimed it could drive dogs mad or cause bees to abandon their hives. Women were warned not to walk barefoot in fields during their bleeding, lest the earth itself grow barren. The stigma shaped daily life. In many villages, menstruating women were kept from the kitchen for fear of spoiling food, barred from the church for fear of polluting the sacred. Some communities forced them into separate huts on the edge of town, spaces of exile where they waited until their cycles ended. To bleed was to be marked as dangerous, a threat to the household, to men, even to God. Physicians, armed with their theories of humors, believed the blood itself was toxic if trapped in the body. Menstrual flow, they taught, was a form of purging, a cleansing of excess. If the bleeding stopped irregularly, it was said the blood would rot within the womb, poisoning the woman and leading to madness or death. To prevent this, doctors prescribed bloodletting, purges, or even intercourse as a cure, believing that a man's seed could neutralize the poison. What to us seems grotesque was to them a form of healing. Yet women carved out their own secret knowledge. Away from the ears of priests and physicians, they passed down remedies whispered between mothers and daughters. Moss and cloth rags became crude but effective menstrual pads. Sheep's wool or leather were sometimes fashioned into absorbents. Herbal teas of mugwort or yarrow were brewed to ease cramps, while cycles were tracked by the phases of the moon. It was knowledge never written in Latin, but preserved in kitchens and gardens, passed quietly through generations. Still, secrecy was survival. To speak too openly of these remedies risked accusations of witchcraft. To be seen bleeding too long or too heavily risked being labeled cursed. Margot would have learned early to hide her pain, to manage her flow in silence, to move through her monthly exile with bowed head. In her world, menstruation was not a sign of fertility or health, it was a stigma. Each cycle reminded women that their very biology was considered dangerous, their bodies vessels of impurity, their blood a threat to the order of both household and heaven. For Margot, even her own lifeblood could be turned against her, another burden in a world already heavy with chains. If the church sought to bind intimacy with laws and prohibitions, medieval physicians and astrologers sought to measure it with stars and humors. To them, a marriage bed was not simply about passion or duty, it was about cosmic alignment. A man and woman were not only bodies but temperaments, combinations of hot and cold, wet and dry. And if these humors clashed, desire could falter, conception could fail, and a household's future could collapse. Astrology was not entertainment in Margot's time, it was science, studied in universities and respected by nobles. The heavens were thought to guide the fertility of couples just as surely as they governed the tides. A hot man brimming with fiery energy might be disastrously matched with a hot woman, their union burning too bright, exhausting itself. A cold woman, on the other hand, might never be stirred by a husband of the same temperament, leaving their bed barren of both pleasure and children. The examinations could be clinical, even grotesque. Wealthy families often hired physicians to inspect a bride before the marriage was sealed. Wide hips were praised as signs of fertility, narrow hips viewed with suspicion. A groom's manhood, too, might be quietly assessed, its size, shape, even curvature judged for compatibility. These evaluations were made with the same detached scrutiny given to cattle or horses, as though husbands and wives were breeding stock rather than human beings. The church, meanwhile, added its own layer of restrictions. It declared that not only blood relatives but spiritual kin could not marry. If a child had been held at baptism by a godparent, that spiritual bond was treated like blood itself. Couples who ignored these rules could later see their marriages annulled, their children branded illegitimate. Even kings and queens were not spared. More than one royal marriage collapsed under the weight of consanguinity laws suddenly discovered, when politics made an annulment convenient. For Margot, these beliefs filtered into everyday life. A village girl might be warned that she would never conceive if she married a man of the wrong temperament, or that a poorly timed union beneath an unlucky star could curse her children. Midwives whispered charms based on lunar cycles. Farmers arranged weddings on days when Venus was favorable. Desire was never simply desire, it was entangled in fate, in the balance of humors, in the turning of planets. It was yet another reminder that intimacy was never private. It was not enough for Margot to yield to her husband, not enough for her to survive childbirth. Even the stars above and the balance of her own body were said to pass judgment on her union. In such a world, love itself was fragile, always subject to forces seen and unseen, calculated and condemned. For Margot, intimacy was not simply a private act, nor even just a spiritual burden. It was her reputation, her family's honor, her very survival in the eyes of her community. In the tight confines of medieval villages, where everyone knew the shape of everyone else's life, whispers could destroy a woman faster than plague. A man's honor was often tied to his prowess, his strength in battle, his fertility, his ability to sire sons. But for a woman, her honor balanced on the narrowest edge, chastity before marriage, fidelity after it. A single rumor could undo her. If she was seen lingering too long in conversation with a man not her husband or kin, tongues wagged. If she smiled too freely at a market stall, suspicion brewed. Even the faintest whiff of impropriety could mark her as unclean, her worth diminished, her marriage prospects destroyed. The weight of shame was heavier for women because it was collective. A daughter's slip brought disgrace to her father. A wife's supposed infidelity tarnished her husband. A sister's scandal shamed her brothers. Margot would have lived knowing that her every gesture, her every glance was not just her own, it belonged to her family's honor. The law reflected this imbalance. Rape, for instance, was not defined as a violation of the woman, but as a crime against the man who owned her. Her father if unmarried, her husband if wed, her lord if she was a serf. The punishment varied not by the suffering of the victim but by the status of the families involved. A noble who assaulted a peasant girl might pay a fine and walk free, while a peasant who touched a noblewoman could face death by torture. Adultery laws cut even deeper. A married woman who strayed faced the ultimate price. Her husband could kill her without consequence, and if she was caught with a lover, the man often shared her fate. Men, however, were not bound by the same rules. A husband could visit prostitutes, take servants to his bed, or seduce unmarried women without fear of legal punishment. The double standard was not hypocrisy, it was enshrined in law, hammered into custom, and preached from pulpits. In such a world, Margot's silence was as much armor as it was oppression. To speak, to protest, to confess desire outside of duty was to court ruin. Women learned to move carefully, to keep their eyes down, to protect not just themselves but the fragile thread of their family's honor. One misstep could unravel everything. For Margot, shame was not simply the fear of being caught, it was the constant awareness that her body was never her own. It was currency, it was property, it was evidence. Her reputation was the tightrope she walked daily, with no safety net beneath. In her world, survival meant silence, compliance, and the hope that neither rumor nor law would turn its gaze upon her. While Margot's daily life was defined by duty, silence, and the weight of family honor, a very different vision of love was blossoming in the castles of Europe. It was called courtly love, and it painted passion not as sin, but as a form of worship. Troubadours sang of knights who pledged themselves to noble ladies, offering devotion not in the bedroom but in the battlefield, in poetry, and in endless longing. In this vision, true love could not exist within marriage. Marriage was seen as a contract, a transaction of property and lineage. But love was dangerous, intoxicating, holy in its suffering. A knight's desire for his lady was meant to remain unfulfilled, his loyalty proved by yearning alone. To love fully was to ache eternally, to embrace desire not for its consummation but for its power to purify the soul. The poetry of Andreas Capellanus, written around 1184, codified these ideals. He described the art of seduction with the same detail Aquinas had applied to prohibitions. There were rules for how a knight might approach, how a lady might respond, how longing might elevate both of them above the sins of the flesh. It was passion reframed as spiritual discipline, a kind of erotic mysticism for the nobility. But this world of roses and verses was a fantasy. For peasants like Margot, no songs of endless devotion shielded them from the bruises of obedience or the dangers of childbirth. For them, marriage remained pragmatic, often arranged by fathers and sealed by livestock or fields. A girl might dream of the blacksmith's son, but if the miller offered a better bargain, her fate was sealed. And yet, the ideals of courtly love seeped into culture, even influencing the ways people understood romance for centuries to come. They created a strange duality. Marital intimacy was reduced to duty, while romantic longing was elevated to spiritual transcendence. Love was imagined to flourish most beautifully where it was least allowed to exist. In practice, courtship rituals developed that reflected this tension. In some regions, betrothed couples were even permitted to share a bed before marriage, but with a bundling board between them, a wooden plank to separate their bodies. The families could thus test their compatibility, without risking pregnancy or sin. It was intimacy reframed as experiment, desire observed through the cold lens of utility. For Margot, these tales of courtly love might have reached her in snatches of song carried by traveling minstrels. To hear of knights and ladies who longed without touching might have sounded like another world entirely. In truth it was. While nobles played at yearning in candlelit halls, Margot faced the stark reality of survival, where love was neither her right nor her refuge, but a luxury she could never afford. Even as the church thundered against lust, beneath the surface of medieval life, ancient traditions endured, rituals older than Christianity, woven into the soil and seasons themselves. Fertility was too essential to survival to be left entirely in the hands of saints and priests. For families like Margot's, the line between holy rite and pagan echo blurred until it was almost invisible. Take May Day for example. Officially, it was a Christian festival of spring renewal, the gathering of flowers and greenery to honor the season. But in truth, it was a celebration of fertility in its most primal form. Young men and women slipped into the woods under the guise of collecting branches, and more often than not, they returned with more than flowers in their arms. The church tried to suppress the custom, but the evidence lingered in the birth records. A wave of infants arriving each February, conceived in the shadows of May. Wedding feasts carried their own rituals. Grain was scattered over the bride, nuts and seeds tossed into her lap, symbols of abundance, prayers for children hidden in the gestures of merriment. The marriage bed itself was often prepared not only with holy water but with charms tucked beneath the sheets, sprigs of rosemary for protection, herbs like sage or rue to encourage conception, sometimes even animal bones or carved talismans meant to attract fertility spirits. These customs were not acts of rebellion against the church, they were acts of desperation, the weaving together of every possible power, sacred or profane, to safeguard the future. In the countryside, midwives and wise women held on to rituals handed down for centuries. A woman struggling to conceive might be told to leap over a bonfire during midsummer, or to drink water collected from a sacred spring at dawn. To ensure a male heir, couples were advised to lie together during particular phases of the moon, or under constellations thought to favor strength. These practices were as much about hope as they were about magic. Even within the walls of the church itself, traces of this syncretism remained. Pilgrims prayed before statues of saints while leaving offerings that looked suspiciously like the charms of older gods. At shrines dedicated to Saint Margaret or Saint Anne, women asked for children, touching relics with the same reverence their ancestors had once given to sacred stones or carved idols. For Margot, these traditions were simply part of life. Her mother might bless her with holy water one evening and then bury a scrap of afterbirth beneath the threshold the next. A crucifix hung at her neck, while an amber bead was hidden against her skin. Faith and folk magic were not contradictions, they were two halves of the same survival strategy. In a world where childbirth could claim a woman's life and where the survival of a family hinged on producing heirs, nothing was dismissed outright. Every prayer, every ritual, every secret herb was one more thread in the fragile net stretched against death. If childbirth was a battlefield, conception was a mystery, and in Margot's world, the mystery was explained by a blend of theology, philosophy, and superstition. Medieval physicians, still leaning heavily on Aristotle and Galen, taught that both men and women produced seed, and that only when these fluids mixed properly did life begin. From this belief flowed a dangerous logic. Since female orgasm was thought necessary for conception, a woman who became pregnant after rape was assumed to have found pleasure in it. Science and law conspired to turn victims into suspects, their very children taken as proof of guilt. But conception was not only about possibility, it was about control. Families longed for male heirs, and so countless theories arose about how to influence the sex of a child. Some said lying together beneath a waxing moon favored boys, while the waning moon produced girls. Others insisted that conceiving when the stars of Mars or Jupiter were ascendant would bring forth sons strong in war, while Venus or the moon would yield daughters. A husband's dominant humor, hot, cold, wet, or dry, was said to shape the outcome, as though the cosmos itself weighed in on lineage. Practical advice mingled with the absurd. Couples were told that the side of the bed on which a woman lay after intercourse might decide the sex of her child. Eating certain foods, hare meat for boys, fish for girls, was also prescribed. Even the wind direction at the moment of conception was believed to matter, carrying with it the essence of masculinity or femininity. The stars were not just consulted for gender but for destiny. Astrologers claimed that the exact position of planets at the instant of conception shaped not only the sex but the temperament of the unborn. A child conceived under Saturn might grow melancholy, under Mars violent, under Jupiter noble. Noble families paid dearly for astrologers to calculate the right moment to lie together, hoping to produce heirs blessed not only in body but in fate. For peasants like Margot, such cosmic timing was less exact. She may not have paid an astrologer, but the wisdom of the moon's phases, the turning of the seasons, and the counsel of midwives still carried weight. She might be told not to conceive on certain feast days lest her child be cursed, or to wait until the spring when fertility was thought to be strongest. Every act in the bedroom was shadowed not only by church law, but by the belief that unseen forces beyond her control would shape the lives of her children. It was yet another layer of scrutiny over her most private self. Even the stars, it seemed, had an opinion about her womb. And for Margot, as for countless women of her age, intimacy was never simply about closeness or desire. It was about lineage, legacy, and the eternal tug-of-war between human will and the vast machinery of heaven. Even the walls of a marriage bed could not keep out the gaze of the church. In Margot's world, intimacy was never entirely private, because confession itself became a form of surveillance. What seemed like a sacred space for absolution was also a tool of control, where priests probed the darkest corners of desire with relentless detail. Penitents were asked not just to name sins but to describe them. A wife kneeling before her confessor might be questioned about how often she lay with her husband, in what position, and with what intent. Priests catalogued these answers, measuring them against the sprawling lists of penitential manuals. These texts read like inventories of sin, whether a couple joined on a holy day, whether a man kissed his wife too passionately, whether a woman took pleasure when she should have submitted silently. Each infraction carried a prescribed punishment: fasts, prayers, pilgrimages, tiny currencies in the economy of salvation. By the 13th century, this surveillance took a darker turn. The Inquisition, born to root out heresy, also pried into sexuality. Accusations of deviance were entangled with charges of blasphemy and sorcery. Suspects were tortured until they confessed not only to forbidden beliefs but to forbidden acts. Manuals for inquisitors included pages of explicit questions. Had the accused lain with demons, with beasts, with partners in unnatural ways? What sounds had been heard through the walls? What pleasure had been felt? The punishments were cruel, designed not just to correct but to terrify. A woman convicted of adultery might be locked in a cage too small to stand, left to starve on bread and water. A man accused of rape might be castrated in public before the hanging rope was fitted to his neck. Fear seeped into every household, ensuring that even in the secrecy of night, couples felt the invisible presence of the church looming between them. For Margot, this meant that sin was not an abstract threat of damnation after death. It was a net cast over her daily life. Her body, her desires, her silence, and even her refusals could become confessions demanded by the priest, fuel for gossip among neighbors, or evidence in the tribunal of an inquisitor. Surveillance was not only external but internal. Through confession, people were trained to police themselves, to feel guilt for pleasure, to imagine eyes upon them even in the dark. It was a cage of conscience, more suffocating than stone walls, more binding than chains. The result was a culture where sexuality itself was not only dangerous but criminal, where the most private moments could be dragged into public light, examined, punished, and used as warnings to others. In such a world, Margot's every breath in Henrik's bed carried the weight of two trials, one in heaven and one in the courts of men.